I welcome you to the 2001 Winter Franciscan Zoom lectures hosted by the Franciscan School of Theology. Our presenter tonight, Maureen Day, is the Assistant Professor of Religion and Society here at the Franciscan School of Theology and a Research Fellow at the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA, at Georgetown University. Her numerous books and articles can be found in both Catholic and academic publications, including her newly published Catholic Activism Today, as well as her 2018 edited collection, Young Adult American Catholics. As a sociologist with training in theology, her teaching and research areas include religion in American civic life, Catholicism, family, and social ethics. She has provided her expertise to the Church at both the diocesan and national level, recently co-authoring the reports for the USCCB's 2017 and 2019 National Studies of Catholic Campus Ministry. Her current book project, co-authored with Michelle Dillon, reports the findings from a national survey of American Catholics. I welcome Maureen.
Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction. It's really nice to be here with everyone tonight. So thank you for coming to think about how this current COVID moment can help us imagine a post-COVID world. And we're going to be bringing in some things from the Franciscan tradition. One second, there we go. All right. So just to give you an overview of where we're going to head tonight. So some of you I know are tuning in from outside of California, some of you even from outside of the United States. For California, March 19th was a big day for us. That was the day that the governor ordered the shelter in place so it's kind of a landmark, or a point in our timeline that's pretty significant. But I'm sure there was your own sort of March 19th and wherever you were at, where things changed drastically from one day to the next. So when I talk about the pre-March 19th moment, go ahead and just translate that into whatever date makes sense for where you're tuning in from. And then the concept that I'm going to be using there is the idea of gratitude and mourning. And then, so during COVID-19, where we're at right now, I'm going to be looking at the Franciscan aeromedical tradition. And aeromedical is just the adjectival way we talk about hermitages. So just if that's not a word that's familiar to you, that's what that means. It's just, so when we talk about aeromedical practices, we're talking about practices in hermitages. And that's going to be the bulk of what I'm going to talk about tonight. We're in that moment right now, so I'm going to spend most of my time with that. And then finally, we're going to close looking at a post-COVID-19 world, using the Franciscan themes of conversion and penance to better understand that. All right. So if you are familiar with the faculty at FST, this is Dr. Joe Kenichi. He's a Franciscan friar here. And if you haven't heard about our continuing education series, I strongly encourage you to make some time this summer to attend one or more of those. They're an excellent way to connect with other people who are looking to learn more about the Franciscan tradition, and to dive a little more deeply into these different ideas over a 5-day period. So I did one of these myself, actually, a couple of years back with Joe Kenichi. He was teaching on communion and critique. And one of the things that stood out to me when I was taking this class with him and about 16 other people was Joe Kenichi said, the Franciscan tradition comes to look at reality through a lens of both gratitude and mourning. And, we hold both of these in tension. We see both the immense goodness within our reality, and we also see where it falls short of its potential. And we see both of these at the same time. And so when I'm thinking about my life before, our shared life before March 19th, so many things I could be grateful for, things that we really took for granted, that were a lot of things that we lost when we had these closures. So for example, spaces. We think about museums we got to go to, churches, that's been a big one. especially for big things like weddings and funerals, not having those spaces to come and celebrate and mourn together. Even more mundane things like meeting a friend at a restaurant or going to fairs and festivals, that sort of thing. We've lost things that help our well-being, things like gyms and fitness centers, being able to meet with support groups, social services, those sorts of things. These are all things that we lost in these moments. Schools and businesses were also dramatically changed. Places we depend on for the logistics of our daily lives and our financial well-being were things that became very fragile, if not closed in our lives. And then just our everyday sorts of gatherings that we do, things that kind of mark important events in our lives, or even just pass the time and reinforce friendship and relationship. Birthdays, holidays were totally different. Neighborhood potlucks and barbecues, that sorts of things, even just having friends over for dinner looked very different than previously. And then travel. And, this includes maybe vacation spots you were hoping to go to. But more importantly, I've heard people mourning the loss of the visits with friends who live distances away, to our home, going back to our hometowns for a week or two to visit with friends and family that are still there. And all of these things were things that made our life normal, that helped us know who we are, embed ourselves in relationships, to contribute to society. They're all really important things. But at the same time, I don't want to romanticize life before the shelter-in-place orders. We also faced a lot of problems. So climate injustice is one of them, the way that human society has exploited the earth and not only does violence to God's creation, but its effects are also most profoundly felt among the poor. We've been talking more about systemic racism. Interracial conversations about racism previous to March 19th were really limited to acts we talked about racism, we meant acts of violence or acts of outright bigotry. We really often neglected the more pernicious and equally dangerous ways that racism continues to shape our social landscape. Polarization was another big thing to mourn in our post-COVID or pre-COVID world. It occurs within our society mainly through political polarization. It occurs within our church. We tend to debate rather than have dialogue with one another. All the data is showing that these polarizations are increasing, that people are becoming more and more polarized rather than seeing a thickening of the moderate middle. And we tend with this polarization to demonize the other person, the other side, rather than actually seek some sort of commonality. Consumerism is another big one. We see growing economic inequality in this pre-COVID life. It signals, we try to signal our status at times through consuming certain goods. We lose our capacity, and we're losing our capacity to reflect really on what the difference is between needs and wants. And once we have a firm understanding of what our needs and wants are, we can channel rather those wants to other people. And to see where that extra income that we would have channeled to a want, to see how that can help somebody else. We see the amount that Americans donate has decreased over the last 20 years. And so this is all kind of coming to a fore. Threats to human life in all of the different stages that human life comes in all the different circumstances. This ranges from minimizing the resources that people need to flourish to human dignity and life itself being under attack. It's really easy in our public discourse to see how sometimes groups are identified as worthy or unworthy of our support and our compassion, whether those are prisoners, the unborn, the migrant and the refugee, the poor, those experiencing homelessness, those in the disabled community, the elderly, lots and lots of people experiencing vulnerability or isolation, depending on what their circumstances are. And so I know that when we talk about wanting to go back to normal, to things to return to normal again, we don't mean these social ills. So as we make plans to re-enter society, what I'd like to say is that maybe we can intentionally choose what sorts of new patterns we want to create instead of falling back into all of the old patterns. And then, so that's my pre March 19th. Then March 19th hits, and the California shelter-in-place order went into effect. It was devastating. Other countries in Europe and Asia were hit much earlier, and we saw how deadly the virus was and how difficult preventing spread was as well. When the shelter-in-place order first went out, there was a sense of this shared fate, that we were in this together, even if we didn't know what that fate was, what was going to be at the end of this. And I noticed that initially there was a sense of social cohesion and social care that animated society at first. A real sense of gratitude for the medical staff and the essential workers who continued to need to go into work while we could work remotely or stay home. So before I go into the spiritual lessons and the opportunities that are present in the pandemic, I want to make it absolutely clear that this was a horrible event for us personally and for us socially. It's claimed countless lives. It's cost many their jobs and their livelihood. It's turned our society and many other societies, if not all societies, upside down. So my talk in no way intends to minimize the challenges and the sorrows that we each uniquely face in this pandemic and sheltering moment that we're sharing. And I'm going to turn now, though, to the resources in the Franciscan tradition that are going to help us better understand how we might still grow during this upheaval and see how we might imagine turning this shared cross into a shared resurrection. And so with this, I turn to the aeromedical tradition. And I want to tell you, first off, I'm very honest that I am not a medieval historian. I'm a sociologist, and that was made clear in the introduction. So I owe a lot of what I'm going to share with you tonight to Dr. Bert Roest. He's a Dutch medieval historian in the Netherlands. And he wrote an article called The Franciscan Hermit, Seeker, Prisoner, and Refugee. Or seeker, prisoner, refugee. And so I'm using a lot of his primary research to think through how the early roots of the hermitages within Francis's life and the unfolding of the order and how that happened, and how we might take some lessons and apply it to our situation today. Okay, so first, imagine, if you will, okay, there's Thomas of Celano wrote the Vita Prima, and it offers us this chance to go to this picture, if you will, moment. So picture, if you will, it's 1209. Francis and his followers were really excited. They were just coming back from Rome, and they received approval for their way of life from Pope Innocent III. And as they're going back home, they're discussing what they're going to do now that they have this approval. Are we going to live the apostolic life, or are we going to live the aeromedical life? And after much discussion, it was decided that ministry was going to be the central piece of it. Not to say that they're abandoning the aeromedical piece, but the apostolic life is going to be central. Francis, and according to the hagiographical account, this indicates that maybe Francis wasn't quite settled even after this conversation, because what he did is he sent two friars, to Sylvester and Claire. Each of them he held in high esteem, and both of them. So he asked them, "What do you think I should do?" And both of them affirmed he should preach. So it's kind of funny. The funny thing about this is both Sylvester and Claire were both people who did not go into much, if any, apostolic ministry. They both led lives that were steeped really deeply in prayer and seclusion. So it's not only funny that he picked these two to help him discern and weigh in on this question, but it's also interesting that they responded the way they did, given the sort of life that they themselves led. And so Francis, after discussing this with his fellow friars and discussing this with his two close colleagues and friends, he decided that he wanted to take an approach that alternated between these two, the apostolic and the aeromedical, and also wanted to foster an attitude. So beginning with alternating, what I mean by that is that Francis himself took important steps in ensuring that he carved out times in his life for solitude and seclusion, so that he could go deeply and devotedly into prayer life and connecting with God in that very private and secluded way. But he also talked about fostering an aeromedical attitude, as it says here, and I'll read this quote. "Even when you are on the road, your conversation should be humble and honest, as if you were in the hermitage or in your cell. For wherever we go, we always take our cell with us. For brother body is our cell, and our soul is the hermit who lives in it, constantly praying and meditating to God. For if the soul cannot remain quiet in its cell, then a handmade cell is of little value to the religious. So once we have actually had aeromedical practices, as Francis very quickly sought out himself, we can discern the ways that we might take these practices once we've lived them in an actual hermitage and take these practices into our daily lives. So we need to make sure that we do have those actual and lived hermitage moments in order to discover what taking our cell with us, to use Francis's words, might look like for each of us in our daily lives. Okay, so what were some hermitage basics? And this is taken from Francis's rule for hermitages. What did it mean for Francis when he wanted to talk about what a Franciscan hermitage would look like? So the kind of what we might call a classic hermitage, it was to be a place of prayer. That was its main function. It wasn't there to hear confessions. It wasn't there to feed the hungry. It was a place of prayer. There were to be 4 friars there, ideally, that was but in practical matters, it was often more than this. But 4 friars were there because this was a number where 2 could be sometimes it's referred to as the mothers, at other times it's referred to as Mary. Those were the people who would take care of the daily tasks. So the people who would make sure the laundry was done, the food was made, the dishes were washed, that sort of thing. And then 2 were able to be the sons, or sometimes referred to as the Mary. So this is the Martha, Mary piece from the Bible. And the sons were able to devote themselves entirely to prayer and the interior life. And then after maybe a week or so, the roles would switch. So those who were the mothers or the Marys, the first week would have the opportunity to be the sons and Mary. And then those who were in prayer that first week would attend to the needs of those who were in prayer. So it would go back and forth. So that was a designated hermitage. But so what did life beyond those things that were designated as hermitages look like? Well, there were some compelling reasons to think that Francis wanted all dwellings to have hermitage elements to them. So he describes really carefully what the ideal friary would look like. And they not only supported apostolic and community life, this outward facing one that Claire and the brothers and Sylvester had all talked about, but they were also conducive to moments of aeromedical retreat during one's daily life. So these places would support poverty. They would be places for both communal and solitary prayer, and they would build relationship. And this idea of poverty was also really connected to the aeromedical piece too. Francis imagined that how could you live poverty joyfully without having this deep an abiding connection to God that was fostered through these aeromedical practices. But this ideal of having all these aeromedical elements within each friary was soon forgotten. This was due to a number of transitions that were beginning to occur, even during Francis's lifetime, as the order quickly grew and administration took more and more resources. So let's look at some of the transitions that were going on. There were external transitions. So there was a shift from the countryside or the outskirts of town. This is where the initial friaries were built, and they had more of a cloister-like structure to them. And then in the 1230s and 1240s, friaries were more often built within the towns themselves. And then in this era also, older friaries, again, who were on the outskirts of town, were relocated to the urban centers and were not built to easily accommodate places for isolation and seclusion that the aeromedical practices required. And so given the order's own sense that it was expected to engage in apostolic ministry, it quickly came to focus on the needs of the wider church. And those were identified as staffing centers of learning, hearing confessions regularly, and also administration. There were also shifts in the quality of preaching that was going on during Francis's day. So Francis's style was more of a preaching of a prophetic style and a call to penance. And then this shift saw preaching change to something that was more about teaching doctrine, teaching church doctrine. And so friaries became, and to help facilitate those shifts, the hearings of confessions and the teaching of doctrine, friaries became centers of learning. and administration, and hearing confessions became a more central task. And there was a shift to emphasize ordination as well, especially as the hearing the confessions became more and more central. Now, so if we're still talking about the earliest days of the order, seclusion was still seen as important, and hermitages that were in the vicinity of the friary were mentioned in the early constitutions. So they kind of recognized, we're not doing these aeromedical pieces so well ourselves within our friaries, but there's these great opportunities to take hermitage moments that are very nearby. So these are mentioned and still lifted up. So you could go there for a designated amount of time and then return to community life. There were also some internal transitions that were happening at this time. The internal shifts are more about transitions and attitudes about seclusion and prayer, attitudes that were pretty at odds with Francis's ideas. So one of these is that clerical friars began to see aeromedical retreat as spiritual idleness. Just as an example of this, Salimbene of Parma, writing after 1250, said that the priests who practiced seclusion and extended prayer were useless for hearing confessions or providing guidance to people who approach them. So he was tapping into a sentiment found in today's expression. You might have heard someone being called so heavenly minded they are of no earthly good. This is not a new sentiment, apparently. This is something that was going on for Salimbene as well, as he looked around at the spiritual practices of those who took aeromedical retreats more often. The retreat had come to be seen by many as a useless luxury, and the idea of alternation that Francis had also embraced became rejected by most Franciscans. Even prominent friars who appreciated retreat realized that this practice had become the exception to Franciscan life. For example, Bonaventure really appreciated it. He made a retreat to Laverna and worked on some important writings there, so that he could use that time to be interrupted and to be able to connect deeply to God, so to be inspired in those writings. And sometimes they are used as a refuge. So for example, John of Parma, who stepped down as minister general, and he was basically exiled to a hermitage for the last 25 years of his life. All right, so what was the fate of the aeromedical tradition? So if earlier friars with aeromedical leanings were tolerated initially, later spiritual dissidents were treated as schismatics and heretics. This is happening right around the time of Pope Celestine V as well, the hermit pope who stepped down after 5 months of being in his papacy. When many Franciscans saw these transition happenings, some fled the area. For one group, for example, went to Greece to try to live their way of life there. In the 1330s, a hermitage was allowed and encouraged to be open. This was marking the beginning of observant reform, including they wanted to revisit aeromedical practices. This reform, took place in a pretty wide range of people and territory. So it was all through the Spanish Peninsula and Italy as well, and it was both the male and female branches of the Franciscan tradition. So while the reform reminded the observance of their aeromedical roots, again, they settled in favor of pastoral efforts. So even after this discussion and during this reform, they say, you know what, we still need to make sure that we keep the apostolic piece primary. And then over time, again, it became increasingly focused on these and then began to neglect the aeromedical commitments. Again, it was the same cycle, same song, verse 2. So this resulted in dissidents who sought more solitude as well as more poverty. Most notably were the Reformati and the Capuchins in the early 1500s. And then there became a kind of a differentiation between friars who identified more as spiritual versus community. And so the spiritual folks are those who understand religious life as emphasizing those aeromedical practices. And the community friars were those whose understandings of religious life emphasized service and outreach and outward ministry. So these two types of friars, the community-oriented ones thought that aeromedical practices were important for the formative qualities that they brought people. So they said, we should still keep these aeromedical practices for our novices and for people early on in their joining of the Franciscans. But it must remain a fringe element. It's not core to who we are. And so this is really something extra that we're given. These aeromedical practices are something that we are is not central and something that we strive for and we can get to if we have time, much like we might think of dessert. It's not essential to it. But the spiritual folks said, no, the aeromedical experience is deeply connected to poverty and to spiritual perfection. We can't abandon this. How is it possible that we engage in these poverty and holiness without the aeromedical practices to support them that were so essential to the life of Francis? And so the spiritual push was suppressed, but the tension remained within the order, and it continues to shape conversations throughout the centuries and even into today. So again, this is very much, I owe a great deal of debt to Dr. Roest over in the Netherlands for his research on this. So after reading the article, I wanted to bring you two takeaways and a question. So first is that Francis recognized the need for both apostolic ministry and aeromedical practices in contemplation. Because of the perceived needs of the church, however, and the shifts that were going on in the order, apostolic ministry was made central and the aeromedical was marginalized. So this is also a familiar story today. So many times I heard from deeply religious people that they would love to have more time to give to God, more time to nourish their own spiritual lives, but then other tasks come along and kind of crowd those commitments out. All right, and so my question then would be, what can we recover, especially now in this COVID moment? So to develop that question a bit more, maybe some other questions I'll offer is, how can this pandemic time allow us to revisit Francis's aeromedical practices? What insights does this time right now offer us in creating a post-COVID world that is more just and more compassionate? All right, and so one of the things I might bring to you is the idea of domestic hermitage. So the Catholic Church has a long tradition of what you might have heard of before, called the domestic church. And what this is it means that the smallest unit of church is the household. What we say of and expect from the church, we can say of and expect from families. So when we talk about church, we talk about households as domestic church. We talk about our parishes. We talk about our diocese. We talk about the church global, right? So the church comes in lots of different units for Catholics. And so what we say and expect of the church, we can say that we expect from families as well. And so Pope John Paul II, just to give you a brief history or a brief outline overview of Familiaris of domestic church, in Familiaris Consortio, Pope John Paul II spells out 4 roles that we can say of domestic church, or of church broadly as well. So this is how you can kind of tell, it's a little 4 checklist. Like you can tell if, like, is our family living just as a family, or are we living as domestic church? And so the first thing is forming a community of persons. Typically families do this well. The second piece is to serve life. Again, typically families do this well. No one does anything of these perfectly, but we do them well. One that's a challenge for American families is the way that we live them now. Is participating in the development of society. This is one that American Catholic families could grow in and improve on. And the fourth one is sharing in the life and mission of the church. So now it seems like Francis, as he thought about the hermitage and how to integrate that into Franciscan life, it seems like Francis not only paved the way for friaries to foster aeromedical practices, but he also shows us the way that we can, like domestic church, create something like a domestic hermitage. So like each friary, each home can incorporate aeromedical practices. Maybe you live by yourself, for instance. Let me just spell out what this could look like. You could be Martha on Monday, do all the chores, cook meals in advance, that sorts of thing. And on Tuesday, you spend your time in prayer. The only work you would need to do is to heat up the food that you'd cooked the day before. Or maybe you live with others. What does it look like taking turns to be the Martha and Mary? What does that look like for your domestic and prayer life? Or maybe everyone could be Martha one day and everyone becomes Mary the next day, taking time to pray alone and to be secluded, as well as coming together for meals and discussing how that aeromedical life is working for you. Formal prayer and study is a great thing that people engage in hermitages. So think about all the different ways that we have to pray as Catholics. There's Liturgy of the Hours, Rosary, Lectio Divina, imaginative prayer, contemplative prayer. There's a huge list. What does it mean to carve out times to engage in these more often? And then to think about study, there are so many resources today, from books to YouTube videos to online retreats, all sorts of things for learning more about God, for learning more about Franciscan spirituality, about church history, so many things. So this is a great practice that we can start at this point. The third piece of cultivating a domestic hermitage is to cultivate interiority, silence, and openness. So remember that the aeromedical life for Francis wasn't just something that happened at a hermitage or at a quiet space. It was an attitude that you cultivated and brought with you everywhere. So we might have different understandings of interiority, of silence, and of openness. So just to unpack these so you understand what I'm talking about here. I mean interiority as going within oneself and bringing that to God. With interiority, as I'm using it here, there's a lot of talking, right? So it's the honest and humble talking that Francis talked about happening in your cell. You bring that to God in your interiority. It's humble talking, honest talking, but talking nonetheless. You're intentional about what's on your heart and you bring that to God. With silence, this is quiet sitting. It's an awareness that you're in God's presence. It is a stillness, and it is a finding of comfort and familiarity in that stillness. It might not be comfortable at first. We might want to fill the silence with more talking or even listening. But silence is about really intentionally placing oneself in a quiet presence before God. And then the final piece is openness. This is the listening piece of this triad. By openness, I mean making room for the nudgings of God. So to be aware of the stirrings in your heart, the stirrings in your mind, and to be open to the invitations God might be extending to us. And so when we can cultivate these practices from the quiet of our domestic hermitage, we're shaping our imagination and our character to be able to bring these aeromedical ways of understanding into our everyday lives. And then the fourth one is evangelization. So Francis was a very evangelical saint. He traveled around preaching penance and wanting to invite people into conversion, into a new way of living. So even while we're still living in this time of social distancing, many parishes are trying to remain connected to their parishioners. So discovering more just, merciful, and holy ways of being in the world is great. And we don't need to wait until the last concert hall and the last museum has reopened in order to start thinking about what we might want to reemerge into and what our world might look like if we bring a spirit of Christian newness to that reemergence. And this is bringing me to this butterfly analogy that I'm offering here. So I think about our life before March 19th as our caterpillar stage. So now as we shelter in place, I feel like we're more at the chrysalis stage now. So, from the outside, if you look at the chrysalis, the monarch chrysalis is an especially beautiful chrysalis. But, from the outside, the chrysalis looks like it's waiting for something, or maybe it's dormant. Maybe you might see it as lifeless or bored. From the outside, it doesn't look like much is going on. But inside the chrysalis, major transformations are occurring. There's a lot of work going on in that chrysalis to emerge as something completely new. So this is what I'm hoping we're shifting to, if we haven't already, with these last months of our domestic hermitages, that we can start to foment transformations of ourselves, transformations of our personal relationships, and transformations of our social relationships as well. So while we're in these final moments, when we emerge from our chrysalis, we'll be dreaming differently. So now we'll take a few minutes to talk about the butterfly phase and what we could look like after our institutions reopen. So the new normal, we've heard lots of people talk about the new normal, especially at the beginning of COVID, and we weren't sure if a vaccination would be here anytime soon. What new normal in those early days usually meant was something close to what we had before, but not quite. It often meant that after the worst of this pandemic is through, We'll stop shaking hands as much. We'll wear masks in groups. We'll be more spaced out in public spaces. And we might even move to online teaching when we anticipate a seasonal outbreak is coming. So none of those really sat well with me based on the kind of person I am. I really like hugging. I miss the potlucks. These are big deals for me. So I didn't want to settle for this version of the new normal. There was nothing that seemed normal at all to me about it. So then I started to think, well, what instead of the new normal and the way it's being used, what about new in the sense of Eastern newness, right? What if by new normal, we meant renewal? We meant renewal of ourselves and renewal of our world. So like this new normal understood that way, that was a vision I could get on board with. And so I have two main ideas I want to bring to you. And the first is conversion. God invites us to ongoing conversion, and Francis discusses the importance of this in his own life. And then the same goes for penance. And conversion and penance were intimately connected for Francis. So to move on to a very familiar story to many of you, I'm sure, Francis and the leper. So there are two versions of this story, two understandings, or I should say. And to be blunt, there really is a right version and a wrong version of the story. So although the story of Francis and the leper is a really well-known story among Catholics, it seems to be popularly misunderstood. And I admit that the first time I heard this story, long before I came to the Franciscan School of Theology, I'd heard the wrong version, the wrong understanding of this. So first I'll just read the story as it stands. And this is Francis's account. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. And afterward, I delayed a little and left the world. So the wrong interpretation of this story goes something like this, that Francis was struggling with a lot. He was, had a lot to overcome, lots of challenges. And then little by little, all these little sins kind of fell away. But the last one that remained for Francis was the leper. So Francis finally builds himself up and he goes and sees this leper. So in this version, Francis's encounter with the leper is seen as the culmination of his conversion. It's the final piece before he goes out and, this is where he becomes Saint Francis really for us. Not so, though, according to the prevailing consensus in the Franciscan community. Franciscans argue that Francis's encounter with the leper was just the beginning of his conversion. So this was his commitment to begin giving himself to God and seeking to live a holy life. So this encounter, we shouldn't see it as an end, but a beginning. And so just to pull out some of the pieces, we can go into other sources, I won't tonight, but just to pull out some pieces that show some evidence for that interpretation. You can see they're underlined now. So what Francis talks about when I was in sin. So it's the phrase here refers to a life that's very different. So we need to understand this as a pre-conversion perspective. When I was in sin, this happened. Another piece here, and the Lord himself led me among them. So Francis isn't talking about his own post-conversion or even near converted discernment that involved his own choice and his volition to go and to see this leper. Instead, Francis seems to be saying that this was external and it was initiated by God, not something that stirred within his own heart. And then the final piece that's in here is what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. So Francis here too talks about his own repugnance as he began this encounter, but he had his own shift in imagination here. He started seeing the human being before him in a brand new light. So this is a testimony to the start of his conversion. So what is powerful in this for our purposes here tonight is Francis is modeling for us what the start of conversion looks like. Right? And the fact that Francis is encountering this disease is another great parallel for us to think about as well. But knowing that this is just the beginning of Francis's conversion should be generative in another way. We shouldn't feel the pressure necessarily to have everything figured out as we reemerge into society. We should approach this as an ongoing project. And it's a project that should always point us towards greater personal and social holiness. And so we journey together toward a renewed vision. Together we go. And that's an important piece as well. which brings me to penance. So just to keep this piece going, Francis refers to this, and it's underlined here, thus to begin doing penance in this way. So this whole event for him is understood within the frame of penance. Francis had looked around at the sin in the world, and he sought transformation. He wanted both inner transformation, that is conversion, and then an outward manifestation of this as penance. So penance and conversion were intimately connected for Francis, and they remain so within the Franciscan tradition. And so as we make our way back into a shared social world, so here's the list I offered earlier, the fruits of social sin within our world. How do we want to repent for these? How can we transform our world into something that is more just and more loving? This list is a very short list, I acknowledge. We could talk about a lot more that we could add to this list for you to discern and to bring to that. But I'd encourage each of us to consider what sort of penance we might be called to, and to bring healing to our world, and to not to try to do this on our own either, right? Francis came to have quite a community of folks that he labored alongside with for the wounds that he'd identified in his own days, which brings me to the final slide, and that's fostering imagination. And so I'm going to close tonight leaving you with some questions. I'm hoping that you bring variations of these questions to your own relationships, that you'll collectively try to imagine what could be together, and how you can together work on some of the things that you identify as reimagining for renewal in our world. So whether you're going through this, going with these, with your parishes, with your families, with your workplaces, or with your communities, whatever group of disciples you want to gather with, what I'm inviting you to ask yourself is, what sort of world do we want to reemerge into? What do we want the new normal to look like? Again, in that sense of renewal and Easter newness. What sort of personal and social practices will this entail? And how can we support conversations and conversions in these COVID times? And so that's the end. Here's my contact information if you have any other further questions you'd like to follow up with me. And thank you for the photo credits that allowed this presentation to happen.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you very much for your lecture. That's certainly a lot to chew on. Let's all give Maureen a collective round of applause. Thank you. Thank you.